If they supply F-16s, and they are talking about this and are apparently training pilots, this will not change the situation on the battlefield. Those were the words of Russian President Vladimir Putin when speaking to his country's Air Force pilots about the possibility of Russia ending up at war with NATO in March 2024. The remarks were followed by the chest puffing that's typical of Putin, as he told the assembled pilots that Russia would destroy any F-16s that entered Ukraine, just as we destroy today tanks, armored vehicles, and other equipment, including multiple rocket launchers. These confident words from a man who's facing up to the seeming fact that Ukraine will be finally receiving F-16s, thanks to the efforts of a coalition of countries, Norway, Belgium, Denmark, and the Netherlands being among them. These are the jets that Ukraine has sought for many months, as the country is increasingly battered by glide bombs launched by Russian fighters from behind the front lines, and their entry into the war will give Ukraine more options in the aerial fight. What does that mean for Putin? Despite his confidence in public, Putin dreads the arrival of F-16s on the Ukrainian battleground. In this video, we're going to explain why. But before we do, it's worth digging into the drama that surrounded the introduction of what may be the United States' most famous jet. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has made no secret of his desire to get his hands on F-16s. From the early days of the invasion, Zelensky has pleaded with his Western supporters to deliver the jets to his country, not least because their versatility makes them an excellent counter to almost any jet that Russia could use in the fight. It also helps that the F-16 will be a massive upgrade on the Soviet-era Su jets that Ukraine has been forced to use so far. Those pleas seemed to fall on deaf ears. The United States represented the biggest hurdle to getting the jets into Ukraine. Though other countries were willing to provide their F-16s, as well as the training that Ukrainian pilots needed to use them, the US was wary of allowing them into the conflict. It was worried that doing so would create additional tensions with Russia, potentially leading to the war stretching beyond Ukraine's borders. Plus, the US argued the sheer amount of training required to pilot the jets would be so difficult and time-consuming that it could distract away from what Ukraine needs to focus on in its fight. America held that position until the summer of 2023. Finally, Washington gave the go-ahead for Denmark and the Netherlands to send F-16s into Ukraine, assuring both that the US would expedite any transfer or approval requests either country made to send the jets in. But there was a catch. The pilots who'd fly the jets needed to be trained before they could be sent over. After all, an F-16 can cost anywhere between $25 and $70 million, depending on the variant. And that's not to mention the military technology that goes into making one. A poorly trained pilot might crash or be shot down out of the sky easier than they should be, leading to the loss of tens of millions of dollars. Plus, Russia might learn more than the US wants from its downed fighter jets. Even so, it was a huge move, with Reuters reporting that a coalition of 11 countries agreed to train Ukrainian pilots after the US gave the go-ahead. That coalition grew to 14 soon after, showcasing the level of support Ukraine has in its fight against Russia. It also means Ukraine could get its hands on powerful jets. The Netherlands alone had 24 F-16s that it was looking to phase out by mid-2024 that it could send to Ukraine, along with a further 18 for sale that Ukraine may be able to buy. But there's a problem. The US appears to have been right on the money when it said that training Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16s would be a long and complicated process. According to Air and Space Forces magazine, senior Pentagon officials believe that Ukraine's Air Force will only achieve initial operating capability with the F-16s at the end of 2024, meaning Russia has nothing to fear from them yet. If that's the case, then why does Putin dread the F-16s so much? Part of it comes down to the approval of their use in the Ukraine war being a sign that the US and its NATO allies are hardening their stance on Russia's invasion. For the first year of the war, NATO nations sent money and military aid, but often stopped short of sending the powerful weapons Zelensky believed he needed to take on Russia. That attitude appears to be changing. Washington's approval for sending F-16s into Ukraine is a sign that it's taking the Russian threat in Europe more seriously than it had earlier in the war. That feeling was intensified in April 2024, when the US finally approved a crucial aid bill that will lead to Ukraine receiving $61 billion in military funding to help it fight against Russia. It's likely that this aid, coupled with further packages coming from countries like Britain and the Baltic Sea states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, will be enough for Ukraine to maintain a strong defense throughout 2024. Just long enough for it to finally be able to unleash F-16s on the battlefield. It's also telling that the four countries that are going to provide Ukraine with their F-16s, Norway, Belgium, Denmark, and the Netherlands, are all members of NATO. The same goes for most of the members of the now 14-strong coalition that's currently training Ukrainian pilots. Putin has referenced this several times. In the same speech he delivered to his pilots about shooting down any F-16s these countries send to Ukraine in Ukraine itself, he also appeared to do a little damage control in terms of what that would mean to the NATO countries supplying those planes. "We have no aggressive intentions towards these states," he said, going on to claim that the idea that Russia would attack another country was just drivel. But Europe is starting to take Putin's actions more seriously. Nowhere is that better displayed than in French President Emmanuel Macron's February 2024 comments that the possibility of NATO troops entering Ukraine couldn't be ruled out. The rest of NATO was quick to backpedal on that claim, with almost all of the major members saying it wasn't a possibility. But Macron doubled down when speaking to The Economist a couple of months later, telling the news outlet that he wasn't ruling anything out. "We have undoubtedly been too hesitant by defining the limits of our action to someone who no longer has any and who is the aggressor," he said when talking about Putin in that article. That's the sort of talk that Putin doesn't want to hear. And though he will be buoyed by the fact that most other NATO leaders are quick to distance themselves from Macron's comments, there's still going to be that seed of doubt in his mind. Could NATO enter the war in Ukraine? If it did, that would pit Russia against major European powers, including France, Britain, and Germany, as well as force it to face the United States. Perhaps Putin doesn't just fear the entry of F-16s into Ukraine. He may also fear what they represent, the rest of Europe, as well as the United States, waking up to his ambitions for the continent and becoming even more willing to stand against him. Putin's comments about not attacking other countries, and certainly not NATO members, are seen in a new light in this context. It's why he's been so careful to point out that any F-16s sent to Ukraine will be shot down in Ukraine. Putin doesn't want to spark a wider war. And he certainly doesn't want a host of countries that have stronger militaries than Ukraine to pay more attention to what he's doing. Now let's switch focus from what the F-16s and the increasing cooperation of a coalition of countries that are sending those planes and training pilots could mean for Putin's war, and toward what the F-16 brings to the battlefield. It would be a massive upgrade on the jets that Ukraine currently has available. At the beginning of the war, Ukraine's aerial arsenal mostly consisted of outdated Soviet planes. Politico said that it had 71 Su-27 and MiG-29 fighters, along with 31 Su-25 attack aircraft and a small fleet of Su-24M bombers. All capable planes, but all Russian-made and understood, as well as being a few generations behind the planes and jets that Russia was able to bring to the battlefield. And though Ukraine has done a good job of defending itself from Russia's attempts to establish aerial dominance, that stock of older planes is being whittled down. Politico reported that it had just 78 combat-capable aircraft in 2024. The F-16 is faster and more versatile than these jets, meaning Ukraine will be able to use it to conduct operations that it couldn't before. Operations such as those involving AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles, or HARMs. The United States has provided Ukraine with these missiles since August 2022, with their supersonic speeds and HE fragmentation warheads making them dangerous precision missiles to use against Putin's forces. The problem for Ukraine is that they haven't been able to get the most out of their HARMs. The missiles were made for use with the F-16CJ, while Ukraine has been forced to deploy them from old Soviet jets for which they were never designed. National Interest points out that this means the utility of Ukraine's HARMs has been dramatically limited. That's because HARMs work by identifying the electromagnetic radiation that radar arrays broadcast, using that radiation for their targeting purposes. Ukraine's problem so far is that its outdated jets haven't been capable of properly operating in contested or Russian-controlled airspace, because Russia's planes could shoot them out of the sky. With F-16s in their arsenal, Ukraine could enter contested airspace using planes designed to utilize HARMs. That would spell bad news for Russia's air defense equipment, such as its own jets, which instantly become targets for HARMs as soon as they power up and start transmitting radar waves. Right now, Ukraine's fighters can only use HARMs in what National Interest called a pre-briefed mode. In other words, the missile is programmed to reach a specific target area before being fired from a long distance by one of Ukraine's fighters. The issue here is that firing from long distances gives Russia a chance to spot the missiles before they arrive, allowing them to power down the radar-sending targets the missiles are supposed to destroy. That won't be a possibility if Ukraine can use F-16s to get in close. When that happens, such as it will when Ukraine has F-16s, Ukrainian pilots can instead use the self-protect and targets of opportunity operational modes that HARMs are designed to use. The former uses the F-16's onboard radar warning receiver to identify radar waves as they're broadcast, passing that data to the HARM so that it can hone in on the location transmitting those waves and secure its target. Then it can hit regardless of whether or not the target powers down its radar equipment when the HARM is coming. As for target of opportunity, that system alerts the pilot when a radar array powers up, triggering them to launch their HARM at it in a more reactive mode. Either way, having F-16s means Ukraine's HARM missiles become more useful, and that spells bad news for Russia when it's coordinating its own aerial assaults. More bad news comes from the fact that F-16s will be capable of operating in Russian territory. Why? They could allow Ukraine to prevent Russia from conducting assaults with its glide bombs. In the early months of the Ukraine war, Russia's aerial offensive was far from as effective as it could have been. Ukraine's anti-air defenses helped to protect it from low-flying craft looking to drop bombs or support ground troops, with Radio Free Europe reporting that Moscow has likely lost at least 100 fixed-wing aircraft since the war began. A change of tactics was needed, and that change came through the use of glide bombs. Also referred to as CABs, glide bombs are repurposed Soviet-era weapons that have proven remarkably effective in Russia's campaign against Ukraine. They typically come in two varieties, a 1,100-pound version called the Fab 500 and a 3,300-pound variant dubbed the Fab 1500. Both are deadly, capable of reducing entire structures to rubble if they hit their targets. However, they're also outdated. The bombs have no advanced guidance systems, which meant that Russia would have had to drop them from behind enemy lines in their previous incarnations. But Russia came up with a very clever way to utilize these bombs. By attaching small wings to the Fab 500 and Fab 1500, Russia gives these massive bombs the ability to glide through the air over long distances. That allows the bombs to be launched from Russian planes well behind the war's front lines, meaning that the planes carrying the bombs aren't at risk of being taken down by Ukraine's anti-air defenses. The older tech in these bombs also plays into Russia's hands, as it makes them much harder to target using modern missiles and defenses. The impact of this innovation has been devastating for Ukraine. Glide bombs played a huge role in Russia's taking of Avdiivka, as a Ukrainian soldier named Igor Shuga highlighted in a post on X, just days before Ukraine was forced to abandon the city. "These bombs completely destroy any position," he said. "All buildings and structures simply turn into a pit after the arrival of just one fab, and they drop 60 to 80 pieces on us in one day." Russia is able to drop so many of its glide bombs for two reasons. First, the wings they're now attaching to the bombs serve as crude guidance systems. That means they can travel toward the vicinity of a target and cause massive damage, even if they don't score a direct hit. Second, those wings allow Russia to launch glide bombs with no danger of them being stopped by Ukraine's anti-air defenses. All are launched from the safety of Russian territory. The only real defense Ukraine could have against these bombs is to send its fighters into Russian territory to shoot down or chase away the Russian jets launching the bombs. That isn't possible with the planes Ukraine has now. They're too outdated compared to what Russia has, and certainly aren't fast enough to stop the glide bombs being launched. The arrival of F-16s changes all that. For context, Russia has generally been using its Su-35 aircraft to launch glide bombs. The Conversation reported that it started outfitting these jets with equipment to launch Fab 500s in March 2023, and it's been running saturation attacks with the bombs ever since. The problem for Ukraine is that the Su-35 is faster than the older Sus and MiGs that Ukraine has. So if Ukraine were to send its jets to try and chase off the Su-35s behind the front lines, they'd find themselves outpaced to the point where the Su-35s could still drop their bombs and even come back to fight the older Sus and MiGs Ukraine sends. That's not to mention that Ukraine's older jets would have to deal with Russia's anti-air defenses. A counter-offensive against the glide bomb-launching Su-35s was practically impossible. With F-16s in its arsenal, Ukraine will finally have a plane that's capable of competing against the Su-35. Granted, the Su-35 is faster, it can reach speeds of Mach 2.5 versus the Mach 2 that the F-16 can reach. However, that's balanced by the Su-35 being larger, making it easier to see on radar, and crucially, easier to pick out of the skies with a long-range missile. So the possibilities start opening up for Ukraine. With its F-16s, it will be able to better engage Su-35s in the air, forcing them to retreat both because the F-16 can almost keep up with the Su-35 and because the missiles fitted into the F-16, such as the previously mentioned HARMs, could down the Su-35. There are also suggestions that the Su-35 isn't as good as Russia claims it to be. That's according to a former US Air Force lieutenant colonel named Dan Hampton. He highlights that the Su-35's wingspan is over 15 feet wider than the F-16s, contributing to it being easier to pick up on radar, and that the plane is a typical Russian machine. According to Hampton, that means it looks good at air shows, but is actually not a great example of a multi-role jet. Perhaps that's why Russia has been relegated to using it to launch glide bombs from its own territory rather than using its S-35s to dominate the skies over Ukraine. Perhaps Putin knows all of this. If Hampton's claims about the Su-35 are true, the arrival of F-16s doesn't just mean that Ukraine reaches parity with Russia in terms of its multi-role fighters. It might have a jet that's actually better than the one Russia is using right now, even though there's a 30-year gap between the first F-16 being commissioned and the Su-35 first taking to the skies. Speaking of radar, the F-16 comes with advantages there too. According to Kelly Greco, who works at the Stimson Center as a senior fellow, Russia is able to spot Ukraine's MiG-29s at a further distance than Ukraine is capable of spotting Russia's aircraft. Presuming the F-16 Ukraine receives are equipped with the AN/APG-66 radar, it will be far more capable of spotting Russian planes, meaning Ukraine can respond to aerial assaults much faster. That will prove useful when chasing down the Su-35s dropping glide bombs, even if it won't be enough for Ukraine to fully close the radar disadvantages it faces against Russia. So the F-16 doesn't necessarily completely outclass anything that Russia can deploy over the skies of Ukraine. But it is much better than what Ukraine has now, and it opens up a wealth of tactical and strategic options that weren't available to Ukraine before. The proper use of HARMs and other long-range missiles will be a boon for Ukraine, with the F-16 also capable of taking on the Su-35s Russia has used to great effect in recent months. The one bright spot Putin can take from all of this is that Ukraine won't have many F-16s, even when it's received every plane that the other nations have pledged to it. According to the New York Times, Ukraine may start with as few as 6 of the planes once their pilots are trained, meaning they will have to be very choosy when it comes to deployment. The same newspaper also reports that around 45 F-16s have been pledged to Ukraine, less than half of the 120 Su-35s that Russia had at the beginning of the war. Putin clearly dreads the F-16s because they make Ukraine more versatile as both an attacking and defensive force in the air. But their importance shouldn't be overstated. 45 F-16s doesn't completely turn the tide in Ukraine's favor when Russia has so many more planes at its disposal. There's still another aspect of the F-16 that Putin fears. It's capable of carrying nukes. Putin mentioned this during his speech to his Air Force personnel in March 2024, and it had been highlighted by Russia almost a year before. In June 2023, Reuters reported that Russia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, told soldiers during a speech at the Dushanbe base in Tajikistan that we must keep in mind that one of the modifications of the F-16s can accommodate nuclear weapons. He's not wrong. Some variations of the F-16 have been altered to make them capable of carrying America's B-61 nuclear gravity bomb. A bomb that's been with the US military since 1968, the B-61 has undergone about a dozen iterations since its introduction. The most recent version, the B-61-12, measures 12 feet and weighs 825 pounds, with B-2A, F-15E, F-16C or D, F-16 MLU, PA-200, F-35, and B-21 models all being capable of launching it. It's designed to have 4 selectable explosive yields: 0.3 kilotons, 1.5 kilotons, 10 kilotons, and 50 kilotons, with its advanced inertial navigation system giving it the ability to strike a target with an accuracy of approximately 30 meters CEP. It's a terrifying weapon, and if used, could change the complexion of the entire war. Of course, there's a caveat to the Russian fear of the F-16's nuclear capabilities. Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons. On top of that, the only country that could supply the B-61s Ukraine would need for its F-16s, the United States, would absolutely not do that unless Russia launched a tactical nuclear strike of its own. So perhaps Putin doesn't dread the F-16s because of their nuclear threat in the immediate sense. Instead, he may dread them because they give Ukraine a nuclear option of its own should Putin ever follow through on his repeated threats to use tactical nukes in Ukraine. Putin rightfully dreads the arrival of F-16s in his war against Ukraine. The plane gives Ukraine more tactical and strategic options thanks to their advanced weapon systems, and the fact that they serve as a useful counter to the Su-35s Putin is using for his glide bomb campaigns. he also dreads their nuclear capabilities, even if the possibility of Ukraine getting its hands on B-61s is practically nil. But perhaps more importantly, he dreads the F-16's arrival in Ukraine because that arrival is symbolic of Europe and the United States taking him more seriously as a threat. Not just to Ukraine, but to other countries should he win the war. Putin's constant mentions of how ridiculous the thought of him attacking another country is may not be indicative of his actual plans. Instead, it may be an attempt to pull the wool over the rest of Europe's collective eyes at a time when Europe seems to be waking up to the threat he could pose beyond Ukraine. But what do you think? Will the arrival of F-16s in Ukraine be a game changer, or does Russia have everything it needs to take on Ukraine's limited supply of these multi-role jets? Do you think the United States might start sending F-16s into Ukraine itself once its pilots have been trained appropriately? Tell us your opinions in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why F-16s in Ukraine will end the Russian Air Force, or click this other video instead.